Welcome everybody again to another edition of Drunk Agile. As always, we are your co-hosts. I'm Daniel Vacanti, and we're not drunk yet, believe it or not. My name's Daniel Vacanti, and with me, as ever, is
Prateek Singh. How is everyone?
Yeah, well, I hope everybody's keeping well. I mean, we're still kind of in the midst of the craziness that is the world in 2020. So I hope everybody's keeping well and keeping safe. And maybe we've got a little bit of something to distract you from all the troubles going on outside. So kind of with that, let's talk about drinking our troubles away. I don't know, Prateek, do you want to go first, or do you want me to go first?
Sure. I have, once again, the Abelauer, probably one of my favorites. The Abunat, that's 59.9% sherry cask, non-chill filtered.
Just so everybody knows, that's a repeat. I think from our very first episode, assuming we're doing
very repeatable.
Yeah, that's a repeat. I, on the other hand, do not have a repeat. And to keep our streak going, again, assuming that we're going to be doing this in order. So this, I think, is the third week in a row that at least one of us has had a GlenDronach. So I selected a 23-year-old GlenDronach. Now, what's a little bit special about this one is it's a bourbon barrel. It was aged in a bourbon cask. And I think Prateek, I was telling you earlier when I was at the GlenDronach distillery, within the past several years, that they've moved exclusively to sherry casks. So because this one's 23 years old, I think this is one of the last batches that they did in a bourbon barrel, which I probably shouldn't be drinking it, but I'm going to drink it anyway. 53.9%. So
you get whiskey to drink it.
Exactly. You don't buy good whiskey, you just rent it. Isn't that the same? Okay. So cheers, everybody. I'm hoping everybody has got a glass of their favorite tipple as well, because because we have kind of a heavy topic now, although, Prateek and I don't think it's all that heavy, but for whatever reason, whenever we try to explain this, people's eyes just glaze over and they don't quite get it. So
just like when we try to explain anything else.
That's true. How do you tell? How do you tell the difference? Man, this is good. This is a good one. I invite everybody to try this. So what we'll do as kind of a departure, what I'd like to do, I'm going to just take a couple minutes to introduce the problem. And then I'm going to say this, that Prateek is going to do most of the talking, but of course I will interrupt him and I will monopolize the conversation, as always. But, hopefully, Prateek, I promise I'll give you a chance to say something.
Yeah.
So in the previous episodes, we've been talking mostly about how to do forecasts for multiple items, and specifically how to use Monte Carlo simulation to answer questions like, well, we have 100 items in our backlog. How long is it going to take for those 100 items to get done? Or we have a release coming up in 6 months. How many things can we get done in the next 6 months? Right? And Prateek and I gave you various techniques and tips on both how to answer those questions and how not to answer those questions. So we've kind of been, laying the groundwork of Monte Carlo simulation, which means we're now ready to answer probably a much more interesting question, which is, let's say that we have a list of features. So let's say, we're a team or we're a department or whatever that's working. We have a backlog of, I don't know what, 18 features. Is 18 a good number? So let's say we've got 18 features that we want to get done in the next release. And let's say, for example, those 18 have a priority. And let's say that we want to get all 18 of those things done by a certain date. How can we use Monte Carlo to answer that question? Should I just give it to you right there, Prateek, or should I say a little bit more? Or because if you can start with maybe traditionally how people might think they might answer that, and then talk about why that's wrong. If you can maybe help us out there.
Well, let's start with everything that we have talked about so far, right? We've talked about, based on what we have talked about, how you would go about answering that question. We've said, look at your team's throughput, run Monte Carlo simulation on top of that throughput, randomly sample the throughput and assign it to future days, and run that thousands of times to find out what percentage of those simulations end up with all these features getting done. And assuming, as you said, that we have a priority order on this, you could probably find what percentage have feature number 3 completing, feature number 5, 7. How deep can we go in that priority order based on the number of stories that we have?
So I don't know if I can interrupt. I told you I was going to interrupt you. So let me ask you a question, because I was drinking and I wasn't listening to you. But did you say you actually know the number of stories in those features?
Well, yeah. Let's say that you have a decent idea that these features are going to be this size, or maybe you already started working on a bunch of them and you already know that, oh, these are about this size, and this is what we're planning on getting done.
So we add up as an input into our Monte Carlo simulation. We take all those features, we potentially add up all the number of stories, and we come up with, I don't know, making up
270, 80,
yeah,
whatever it is. Yeah.
203, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And we're like, okay, how long is it going to take us to get these 203 stories done? We can run our traditional Monte Carlo, and like you said, it gives us a percentage chance of getting those 70, 80, 203, whatever. Yep. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Okay,
that's a traditional way of doing it.
That seems reasonable to me. Why wouldn't we do that? That's how I would approach it. Why is that problematic?
So it's a great place to start. To begin with, great place to start. It's making a few assumptions. Assumption number 1, which is essentially the assumption behind Monte Carlo, the way we talk about it regardless, is that the future looks a little bit like the past. So we can use the past to predict the future. Assumption number 2, which we don't explicitly talk about, which we are talking about today, is just because we have a priority order, we're working in strict priority order, as in we're going to get all of feature 1 done, then all of feature 2 done, then all of feature 3 done. And for most teams, for most departments, whatever level you're running that Monte Carlo on, that's not usually true. That's not usually, it's either not doable or teams aren't usually doing it, but it's not usually true. And not accounting for that assumption leads us down a very dangerous path.
So if I can interrupt you, I don't know if this is the right place to talk about it, but will you be mentioning, what about the objection? Well, but if we have to get all 18 features done anyway, who cares about priority? Why does priority matter? Are you going to talk about that now, or should we wait?
I think we should wait on it a little bit, because okay. As we talk more and more about how this concept of how many features, because really what we're talking about is how many features are we working on at the same time. As it comes into play, it would be great to kind of reveal how that progression goes and where we end up being. Meanwhile, Nisha's being extra active today.
I'm pretty sure she's going to be the star of this show. Nobody's going to tune in to listen to us. They're all going to want to know.
She doesn't even have to drink whiskey. So
yeah, what's Nisha doing? Yeah.
By the way, Nisha hates whiskey, just FYI.
Yeah. Yeah, she's German. What are you going to do? Okay, so the first assumption was the past
future looks like the past, which
and that's fine. I think we can live with that one. Second one is that we have a priority and that we're working in priority order. And then the third assumption that you kind of alluded to, I don't know if you said specifically. Did you say it specifically? Which is,
I don't think I said it specifically. No.
But okay, so the third assumption is what?
The third assumption is that we are working only one feature at a time.
Right.
Yeah. That's assumption number 3, and that potentially is the most dangerous of those assumptions.
Hopefully, if anybody has studied flow and anybody has studied things like Little's law, you know that the assumption of only working on one thing at a time is a very, 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 very dangerous thing. Think about your existing context. How many times are you only working on one feature or one project or one thing at a time? Okay, so walk us through why that's where those assumptions break down, and how they manifest themselves in forecasts.
Yeah,
if you can.
Probably the best way to do it is actually do it by example, because we're already waving our hands too much on this thing. So I'm going to show an example here. And while this is coming up, there it is.
I can see it now, yeah.
Perfect. What you're seeing is actually the same file duplicated on both sides. So you're not seeing double. That's intentional. You'll see why.
How many drinks have I had?
Despite the fact that Dan's almost at the end of that glass, he's not seeing double.
Okay, but if you can just kind of run us very quickly, what are we looking at here?
What you're looking at least this colorful portion that you're looking at, that table that you're looking at, is a table of features. I'll just go column by column. The first is the description of the feature, the name of the feature. Second is the priority of that feature, and you'll see that, as we said earlier, 18 features. You'll see that priority number goes all the way from 1 to 18. The third column there is a number of stories that we currently know are in that feature, or currently expect to have in that feature. This team has done some level of analysis. They've even started some of these features, what we expect to have in that feature. And the last column there is the chance to finish that feature within the release, as calculated by Monte Carlo. So we ran this for the next 30 days and said, for this team, whatever their throughput was, if I run Monte Carlo, assuming we have 30 days to go in the release, what is the chance that each of these features gets done? And as you can see from our earlier discussion, as you go down in priority order, that chance to finish decreases from 100 to 99 to 77, all the way down to 1.7. So as these stories keep accumulating, the chance to finish keeps going down.
I'm pretty sure accumulating is not a word.
I know, that's why I changed it to accumulating.
Okay, yeah. Okay, good.
I wanted to say cumulatively adding up, but accumulating does that.
Okay, yeah, all right. So just to reiterate, this is the case where all of those assumptions that you just mentioned are in place.
Yes.
Specifically that we have a priority, and that this Monte Carlo is assuming we're only working on one feature at a time, and that we're getting the number one priority feature done before we start the second priority feature, and then we get the second priority feature done before we start, right? Okay.
So for example, in this case, by the time we get to this feature number 7, we have done 5 plus 1 plus 2 plus 1 plus 1 plus 7 stories. And then we're going to do the 13 that are in that feature number 7. So we're going to keep going down.
Well, this is great. This is great. I wish I had this for my job. What's wrong with this?
So again, this has that assumption number 3 in place, which is that we're working not only are we working priority, we're working one feature at a time. I am not touching feature 2 at all unless I've finished all stories for feature number 1.
Right.
Which, again, as I said earlier, does not happen to be true in most scenarios. In most real world cases, that's not true. There might be places it is true, but most places it isn't.
Okay.
In fact, in my context, the teams I work with are all upwards of 15 people. So it's very unlikely that they're working on only one feature at a time.
All right. So let's look at, okay. So what happens? I know what should we start with if we're working on 2 things at a time, or
so let's do the same thing now. Before we even show the results of working on 2 things at a time, let's see what, just practically speaking, what happens when we're working on two features at a time. If our feature WIP is 2, we're working on these 2 features. When one gets done, we pull the next one in, and the next one gets done, we pull the next one in, and as either of those features goes down to 0 stories, we pull the next one in. That is how we would model that in Monte Carlo as well, to say at any point of time, 2 features are active. When one feature gets done, we pull the next highest priority in. When the next feature gets done, we pull the next highest priority in. If we do that, the throughput of the team that so far had been contributing towards only one feature bifurcates and contributes towards 2 features at a time. So the probability of finishing, the chance to finish, starts to decrease a little earlier than you would expect. So let me show you so I'm going to keep the left pane frozen, where we're showing the Monte Carlo with a feature WIP of 1. And I'm going to scroll down to when it's feature WIP of 2. So as soon as we change that feature WIP to 2, as you can see right here, you can see that these numbers start to change a little bit.
Immediately there's kind of some interesting things that pop out.
Yeah.
So I don't know if
Yeah,
you want
you
to
can
talk
see,
about
and
a
so
couple of those.
just for the color coding, I haven't gone into it yet. This is just arbitrary color coding that I came up with, essentially to say anything that's above 85% is considered green. We're highly confident this will get done. Anything between 65 and 85 is considered yellow. That this is starting to become too risky. Anything below 65 is just red. This is risky enough. We need to talk about it. So,
And for the astute viewer out there, you can see on that left pane, there's that text that kind of explains that's showing right now. So you've probably seen that, but yes, okay. But the color coding is arbitrary, but it is instructional. So let's talk about, obviously some colors have changed here. What's going on here, Prateek? What's happened with our feature WIP 2?
If you look at that feature that used to be yellow, which was that priority number 9, it has gone deep red. It has gone from 77.7% of the simulations having it finish to only 23.3 or 23.4% of simulations going, this thing can get done. And literally the only difference between these two panes is that feature WIP. We haven't changed the underlying throughput. We haven't changed, as you can see, the number of stories attached to each feature. We've not changed the priority. The only thing we've changed is running the simulations as if we're working on 2 features at a time.
Yeah, and there's an interesting thing here. I mean, the thing that kind of jumped out at me too is you can see that accessibility for retirement plans actually went from red to green, and solidly green.
Yeah, it's really interesting that something that's much lower priority all of a sudden becomes a much higher, has a high chance to finish.
Which there's an undercurrent here that the argument could be made potentially that working on more things is potentially better, which is quite possibly true. And I don't know, maybe that might be something for we probably shouldn't talk about that in this particular thing. But assuming a feature WIP of 1 and only working on in a way of a feature WIP of 1 might not necessarily be optimal. Right. And this might help reinforce that, but that's a separate topic altogether. But just some interesting results. So the yellow went from kind of solidly yellow to solidly red. And then the next one, number 10 priority, went from solidly red to, well, actually kind of marginally red to solidly green.
Red, solidly green. Yeah.
But still.
And you can even see the one after that went from about 34 to 53, which is still a decent jump.
Yep.
But let's keep going down this track and let's make it feature WIP of 3.
Let's
do that. Now you can see that I mean, the same trend sort of continues. That feature number 9, which had gone from 77 down to, what was it, 23 odd, is now down to single digits.
That's, yeah. I mean, that, for people watching at home, that 5.42%, for all intents and purposes, is 0, right?
Zero, I mean,
that's not going to get done, in this scenario anyway. But
that's
the one after it,
I was going to say, for you Dungeons and Dragons fans, that's a critical hit.
Yeah.
Or a critical miss, either way.
Yep. That's so. We're rolling a D20, and we've got to get exactly 1 or something like that. So, but the accessibility for retirement plans actually looks better. As bad as mobile view looks, accessibility looks even better.
What's actually, and further down, if you go further down the list, you can see that there were features that were in this. Like there was one feature there, the W4 shared and mobile web experience. It went from single digits up to 31-32%. And in fact, one of the other features, the pay availability one, is now above 50% chance.
So yeah, I mean, if you're a product owner, you're kind of loving the world right now, because you're like, oh, so you're saying there's a chance, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the pay availability, I've gone from 17% to 52%. Now flip a coin. It's like, okay, I'll take that, right? I'll take that bet. Okay, but it gets worse, right? Because I mean, do teams really only work on 3 things at a time? Probably not. So maybe we should fast forward to kind of a more realistic scenario, which is, let's say, which is a more realistic, something like I don't know, 10 features at a time.
Yeah. What happens if we are working on 10 features at a time.
Yeah.
And there's the result. There's the grid for that. There's the results for that, which are the first time I ran this, I wasn't as surprised as I should have been, but I was pretty surprised.
But I mean, hopefully everybody, I mean, we should pause here and let maybe people just kind of study this for a second before we start, chatting in their ear. There's some astonishing things going on here. And hopefully the side-by-side view is, I think, great that kind of illustrates this. So I don't know, maybe kind of soak this in for a second, but okay, Prateek, yeah, kind of take it away. What's kind of the big things going on here?
So once again, just to reiterate, between these two pictures, the only thing that has changed is the feature WIP, the number of features we work on at the same time at any given time. Everything else is the same. All other assumptions are equal. So everything else being equal, just by changing feature WIP, you can see that when we work on 10 things at a time, for example, that number 10 there has jumped into the yellow. It's 83, 84% at this point. It used to be only 62, and you can see some of the higher priority ones have actually turned red. What's the most interesting for me, at least, is your number one feature. The number one feature that we wanted to get done, which was at almost 100 early on, has now dropped down to that 83, 84% range, which is the same as the number 10 feature.
And I agree that is by far and away, to me, the biggest takeaway. Because think about this from a product owner or product manager perspective, right? If I'm looking at the simulation on the left, I'm like, absolutely, for certain, 100%, I am going to get my number one priority feature. It's my number one priority feature, so it should be the most certain thing on the board, right? That's the whole point of prioritizing, is because my number one feature should be the thing that I get. But if we look in the real world, if we're modeling the real world where we're actually working on 10 things at a time instead of just one thing at a time, now my number one feature, not so certain. In fact, it's a lot less than certain. And and what's shocking is my number 15 priority feature is actually, I have more confidence in getting my 15 priority feature than I do in my one priority feature. I mean, that's, like I said, if you just put your product owner hat on or your product manager hat on for a second, this is profound, I think.
Yeah, like even your number 17 feature has about the same chance as your number one feature.
Yeah. Think about that. I mean, you've gone through all this work of prioritizing and saying, this is the thing that I want by this release. But by the end of the release, I could get feature 17, but potentially not feature number one.
Yeah, you've not only you've probably collected all this data from customers. You've probably collected a whole bunch of feedback from places to go, oh, that is the highest priority thing. Not only have you spent all that time doing that, meanwhile, at the end of the day, you might have to go back to your customers and say, hey, that number one thing, that really didn't get done, but number 17's there.
Right. And you probably, when you were going through your prioritization exercise, you probably made some sacrifices and some trade-offs and things like that to get that thing to be number one. Like, this is my number one priority. This is the one that I have to get. You probably did some of that trading, a lot of trade-offs. You did a lot of work to get that to be your number one priority feature. And it turns out, okay, great. You got feature 17 instead. Right. So.
Yeah. And just to reel this back a little bit, I sort of get why it's counterintuitive, or why it's at least unintuitive. It's because we're naturally programmed to think that if we put things in priority order, it will just happen in priority order. When we have capacity, it goes top down. It doesn't go sideways, as we're talking about here. Right. The fact of the matter is, when you work on more than one thing at a time, all those things that you're working on at that point are priority one. If you're working on the top three things at the same time, you have a top three. You don't have a 1, 2, 3. Those are the same level priority. And that's what this is reflecting.
Yep. So instead of encapsulating risk feature by feature, now what we're doing is we're actually spreading that risk off, across several features. And I know you're going to talk here in a second about how that risk kind of manifests itself.
Yeah.
But that's really what's happening is we're now spreading that risk. And if you're looking closely, you can see, how that risk is manifesting. There's certain attributes of these features that cause them to accumulate more risk than others. And they might, it might seem obvious to you. It wasn't necessarily obvious to me, but this should be, even if it is kind of confusing, it should be obvious to you. The more things that you work on, the less chance you have of getting all of those things done. I mean, this is a lesson of this is a lesson of Little's law. This is why we talk about limiting work in progress in Kanban. This is why that theory is so important. Yep. So help us understand why are some features looking better, some features working worse? How is that risk really manifesting itself? Why does that happen the way that it does?
Yeah, as Dan, as you just very eloquently put, that risk is being redistributed.
Right.
That the same amount of risk that exists on the left-hand side sort of exists on the right-hand side. It's just been redistributed. And the best way to show how it has been.
Sorry, say that again slowly, because that's great. You said it better than I did. Say that again.
The same amount of risk that exists on the left-hand side also exists on the right-hand side. It just has been redistributed amongst the features.
Right. That's key. That's key. Yeah.
By virtue of working multiple features at the same time, we've redistributed that risk.
Right.
The best way to kind of show how it got redistributed is actually to go to the other extreme, from working on one feature at a time to working all features at the same time. What if we started all features, all 18 at the same time? We put them, we lined them up and said, ready, set, go. What happens then?
Are my eyes playing tricks on me? Is 18 actually better than 10? Is it? I don't know.
Is 18 better than 10? I don't think so.
Oh, okay. I don't know. It's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard to say.
If you look at that number one feature, it's dropped from 83 to 75. Meanwhile, this one is now 1.4.
Yeah. Anyway,
now,
go ahead.
Yeah. So what ends up happening, of course, is as you go from one. Let's look at these two extremes. I just want to look at these two extremes. Let's forget about the others for now. As you go from working on one feature to working on all of them at the same time, that risk that with the one feature case was all at the bottom of the priority order. As you went down the priority order, the risk to the feature increased. Now, and I don't have the table sorted in that manner, but if I sorted that table with the W.I.P of 18 by feature size, as in by number of stories, you will see that any feature that has just one story will go all the way to the top, will have the lowest amount of risk, and the features with the most number of stories will have the most amount of risk. So for example, if you look at any feature that has only one story in it, which is like feature number 2, feature number 4, 5, 13, and 15, they are all 99% and above. Meanwhile, feature number 7 that has 13 stories and feature number 9 that has 23 stories, those have dropped to the bottom of the pile. In essence, what happens as you start working on more and more features at the same time is you start moving from priority order to size order.
So many questions here. Again, from a product owner perspective, what's interesting about this, see, now you have a better chance of getting your lowest priority feature than your highest priority feature because of what Prateek just said, because your lowest priority feature is only 4 stories, where your highest priority feature is 5 stories. You wouldn't think it would make that big of a difference, but it does, right? And then the second thing that we need to talk about is kind of the last thing you said was this whole priority thing and the effect of size on priority. So this is something we were talking about before the call. So Prateek, why isn't this an argument for, well, obviously this means we need to know exactly how many stories are in a feature, because we need to know that mobile view is 23 stories. And the only reason this works is because we know mobile view is 23 stories. Why is this not an argument for that?
In a way it is, but then you're adding the extra assumption of nothing will change.
Yeah.
Because knowing that exact size is one, almost impossible, and two, having that sort of, we talked about probabilistic versus deterministic thinking a few episodes back. Having that sort of a deterministic view will only lead you to incorrect conclusions.
Yep.
Now, what it does get us to, though, is having a great disparity in size and features might be very, very dangerous.
That's what I was hoping you would talk about, right? Because I don't know how much in the past few episodes, I don't know how much we've talked about right sizing, or the effect of, because essentially what we're saying here is the effect of batch size on uncertainty. That's essentially what we're seeing here. And obviously a feature that has 23 stories is much, much more uncertain than a feature with even, say, 4 stories, right? Or, 5 stories. And so the lesson, unfortunately, I think the takeaway for most people would be, well, okay, obviously this is why we need to know that mobile view is 23 stories so that we can assess this risk. That's not, while that's kind of the lesson, it's not really. The lesson is, why the heck is the mobile view feature 23 stories? Why? What did we do to let it get that big? Because we know when it's that big, it's that size is going to accumulate all the risk. Accumulate, not accumulate. It's going to, it's going to be, there's going to be a giant sucking sound for all the risk, the bigger that a feature is, And so the takeaway here needs to be, not that we need to know exactly how many stories are in a feature, for me anyway. The takeaway is we need to understand what is kind of that threshold at which risk becomes unacceptable. And we need to start breaking up our features into smaller features, because that's the better strategy for getting these things done.
Yeah, and that's, and I think I don't know if we've said this before or not, but if I were to advise a team to do anything, any 2 things, I'll just do these 2 things. Work in small batches and limit WIP. That's essentially all you need to do. Everything else takes care of itself. Obviously, this team seems like they were trying to do that, but they let 2 of those features get away from them, or 2 of those features are where they haven't done that yet. And that's exactly what the product manager should be looking at, because I think product management is probably the harder job overall in software development, because it's as much about saying no to what we are going to do as it is about saying yes to what we're going to do. As in, that feature in there with 23 stories probably is trying to solve 5 different problems.
Exactly. Well, so now let me ask you this, Prateek, because I don't know if you have a visual for this, but okay, so now I'm a product owner or product manager, and I'm looking at this, and I'm looking at this mobile view feature, 1.41% chance, and that's 0, right? I am not getting that in this release. I am just not. Okay, so let's say, okay, well, I don't want it to be my 9th priority feature. I want it to be my number 1. I want it to be my number 1 feature.
Yeah.
If I were to do that, does my risk change?
In a WIP of 18?
In a WIP of 18, does my risk change?
So short answer is no.
Yep.
Long answer is I don't have a view for that.
Okay.
But yeah, in this case, it won't change. It will be exactly the same.
And that's, to me, that's how many times have I said that's key, right? I think I've said that. Somebody, we should take a drink every time, right?
Yeah.
Right? Because kind of the tool in most project managers or product managers' toolbox in terms of managing risk is, okay, well, if this thing looks risky, we'll just make it a higher priority. And what we're showing here, hopefully what we're demonstrating here, is simply by making it a higher priority ain't going to get it done, right? That's, in a high WIP environment, making it a higher priority has little to no impact on your ability to get that particular feature in this release. And so you might think, well, of course, it's my number 1 feature, I'm going to get it. You're not going to get it because you're not controlling WIP.
Yeah, and in lieu of controlling WIP, the only tool, because priority is not a tool anymore, the product manager has left in his or her arsenal is, can we make the feature smaller? Because we have gone from a WIP of 1 where priority determines what gets done and what doesn't, to a WIP of all where size determines whether things get done or not. At that point, can we make this thing smaller?
Say, I keep telling you to say that, but if you can say that again, because that's really the big takeaway is
Yeah.
what's the lever? What's the determiner of risk in these environments? In the
Yeah.
low WIP environment, what's the one? How do we handle risk? How do we?
So in general, product managers have essentially two ways of figuring out of handling risk. There might be others too. At
Technically
least,
three. Technically,
yeah. Well, but in the case where we're talking about right now, where we're not going to be able to move the date.
okay, four. Technically four, because I was thinking about
Okay.
size, but that's
Oh
okay.
yeah. Well, we're gonna talk about size kind of, but yeah.
Okay.
In WIP of one, when in extremely low WIP environment, if you move these features around in priority, you're able to affect what is the probability of them getting done. It doesn't the size of them will matter a little bit, but the priority is the bigger determinant. In a WIP of all, where you're working on all of them at the same time, moving them around in priority will do nothing. The only lever you have left at that point is the individual feature size. Is how can I make this feature smaller? What can I get out of here in order to get this thing done?
Yeah, I mean, I just think that's so cool. That result in and of itself is just so cool, because intuitively, as a product manager, you think the hammer that you have is priority, and if you're not controlling WIP, priority is a fool's errand, right? I mean, it's like who cares, right? Like you said, they're all priority one.
The thing is, it doesn't take a WIP of 18 to show that, right? If we go back to way back early on, when we were looking at a WIP of 2, even in the WIP of 2, the size, just because this feature number 9 is so much bigger than the other features, already starts to dominate. It already starts having the effect of, this thing has gone from being 7, it's dropped by more than 50%. It's and you don't have to be in an environment where WIP is every feature. You might be still in an environment where WIP is only 2 features, and it already starts to have an effect.
Right, and so this is, as for the product managers out there, and really for development teams as well. Product managers have, I think, had beaten into their heads, priority. It's so important to have a prioritized backlog, and it's so important to work, priority. But as a product manager, I would argue your bigger frustration, your bigger source of anger, if you will, should be if teams are not working in a controlled WIP environment. That's where you should get really upset. You shouldn't get necessarily so upset about if they're not working in priority. You should get upset about that. But your bigger source of anger should be if they're not controlling WIP, because it's when they don't control WIP that now this stuff becomes completely unpredictable. Throw priority out the window, and risk can pop up wherever, and that's the problem.
Yeah, and if we haven't made this point already, if you just consider a very, very extreme case of this, imagine that first feature is 50 stories, and everything else is 1 story. Your view on the left hand side will go, the first one is for sure, and then there's a decreasing order in which things can happen. The view on the right will go, the first feature is definitely not going to happen, but all the others will. Because if you start all of them at the same time, those 1-story features are just going to get knocked out. Meanwhile, that big, huge feature will take forever. Okay. And that's the effect that we're showing by introducing feature WIP into our Monte Carlo simulations. Right.
So this has been a fairly dense episode. I have to say it's been kind of one of my favorites because I think that the content is impactful and so important for people to understand. So I mean, if we can just kind of wrap up. While Monte Carlo is an extremely powerful tool, you have to be very, very, very careful about the assumptions that you're feeding into it. And you may not even realize the assumptions that because there are a lot of tools out there, again, without naming names, there's a lot of tools out there that will say, oh yeah, just feed these features and feed these, priority order, and you're going to get a view like the left side of the picture here. But that is not a realistic, a more realistic, more accurate, if you will, view of the world. Because if we're really working on, even 3 features or 10 features or, God forbid, 18 features at a time, your understanding of risk changes dramatically. And so that's really kind of the big takeaway, as Prateek said. In controlled work in progress, limited, environments, the lever that you pull is priority, right? It's kind of what you've been taught. Unfortunately, we work in these contexts in the world of very, very high WIP environment, and in that case, you prioritize all you want, not going to matter. In that case, it's really about the size of the feature. So this is yet, if you haven't figured it out, this is yet another reason why we hammer home this idea of control work in progress, control work in progress, control work in progress. But as Prateek said, just even controlling work in progress is not enough. At some point you are still going to have to control that batch size. Even if you control work in progress, that 23-story feature is still way too big, and probably a candidate for breaking up. So since you did all the hard work in putting together the simulation, obviously everybody should thank Prateek for all the hard work for putting this simulation together. Prateek, I will give you the last word on this. What else would you say about feature WIP Monte Carlo?
Yeah, the one thing that I will say, and you kind of hit on that earlier, go back to this WIP of 2 and WIP of 3 simulations. Even if you're controlling WIP, if you're not controlling batch size, frankly, you're not controlling WIP, because all you're doing is hiding WIP in those big batches. So you might think you're controlling WIP, but you're actually hiding WIP in those big batches, as you can see here. And that is why you would want to include your feature WIP into your Monte Carlo simulations, because it will expose where you're hiding WIP so that you can then attack that, because that is where risk is hiding.
Very, very, very well said. So you may want to rewatch this episode 2, 3, 4 times, because we did cover a lot. I personally think it makes intuitive sense. Obviously, the more things that you work on, the more risk that you are going to assume. That, to me, that's just obvious, I think, but for a lot of people, it's not. It's hard to argue with these numbers that Prateek has put together. So thank you very much for watching. Thank you very much for sticking with us through this whole thing. Like I said, it is, it was a fairly dense topic. But for this episode, I think we're going to call it good for this episode of Drunk Agile. So for Prateek Singh, my name is Daniel Vacanti. Thank you very much for joining us. Keep drinking whiskey. I'm out. I need to go to my next one. So keep drinking some whiskey, and we'll see you in the next episode. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.